Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to all of you for the release of Vishwa Shastra, Dhruva's first of many books that he is going to chronicle in his journey as a leading thinker of Indian strategic direction, strategic past, and of course, strategic architecture. In fact, I don't want to talk about the book. I will briefly touch on the book, but I really want to talk about Dhruva here. And I was thinking that when I first met him many, many moons ago, substantially in cold Stockholm, if I remember correctly, where he was hosting a trilateral forum, I was struck by two qualities that have endured since that first meeting. Dhruva, unlike some others in his family, and in this, when I say family, I don't mean the family, I mean in the foreign policy fraternity, has a very gentle demeanor about very persuasive arguments. He makes very strong points with a certain grace and a certain gentleness that sometimes, in many ways, only strikes you post digesting his argument. And I'll tell you, this book, he has done a few things which you must watch out for as you read the pages. He has in many ways re-described the anthology of the Indo-Pacific and India's play there very gently. Actually, he has changed the playbook without claiming to have done that. He has introduced origins of this whole engagement in a manner which will surprise you after you have actually read through the entirety of the book. He has placed it in a very different framework, and you won't even get to know as you read it. And that's something that Dhruva, I remember, has done so over the last 15 years. Gently, he has changed things significantly. And I think that's one thing I remember about Dhruva. The second thing I remember about Dhruva is that if foreign policy was the cricket field, and if Dr. Jaishankar is Virat Kohli or Sachin Tendulkar or Virender Sehwag in different days and different times, Dhruva is VVS Lakshman. He has this languid ease as he fields some important issues and subjects and topics, and this book actually does that. And he picks up India's old engagement with its trading history, in many ways arguing in his initial pages that we were present everywhere where there was business to be had. India was present everywhere where there was an opportunity. And in many ways, India's international engagement has been a continuum, and contrary to many arguments where some people suggest that there was a discontinuity, his book suggests there is a continuum. The only discontinuity was in the chronicling of India's engagement. And that is now something that we've seen in the recent past, which has been added to our libraries and our shelves and our bookshelves, that we are seeing Indian authors writing about India's engagement more prolifically, and Dhruva's recent book is perhaps one of the most important ones. And that's something, and he's done it against, like VVS Lakshman, that big innings, without you realizing that he has nearly changed the match without any of those big spectacular strokes that some other batsmen are well known for. So in some sense, that is the second thing I remember about Dhruva. He has a languid charm while he is batting and he's fielding. But finally, I think he's also something else. He, like his book suggests, he likes to connect and collect at the same time. And he's also an institution builder as the head of ORF America. And that's something that must be mentioned here, that he took over this challenge during the pandemic, and he's put together an institution which is perhaps bigger than we thought it would be at this point of time. He has built a team with him in that particular geography, and that team works across the globe. So it's not restricted to just North America, but it has significant contributions in different parts of the world. So pretty much this is what I wanted to share about Dhruva and my experience with Dhruva. And of course, through this, I have also shared some thoughts about the book, which I think are significant and why it is going to be an important one for all of us to read. So well done, Dhruva. Let me congratulate you, and let me congratulate Penguin and Manasi, the editor of the book, for this wonderful publication. And welcome once again to this evening, and thank you for joining us on this very special occasion. This is the first of 10 books Dhruva is going to write in the next decade. So welcome to the first one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saran. May I now invite Manasi Subramaniam, the editor-in-chief at Penguin, to introduce the book for all of you. Please, Manasi.
Samir, that was first of 10 books in 1 decade, so that's 1 a year. We're all set, Dhruva. So, good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome you all to the launch of Vishwa Shastra, India and the World. And what a world it is. Tonight, we gather at a moment when the world's attention is increasingly being drawn to India, not just for its economic heft or its demographic weight, but also for its intellectual and strategic contributions to the global order. I think this book could not be more timely. Dhruva Jaishankar's book is one that combines a historian's depth with a strategist's foresight. Vishwa Shastra is ambitious in its scope and clear-eyed in its analysis, moving effortlessly from ancient maritime corridors to modern diplomatic corridors. It tackles questions that resonate today. How does India balance its rich past with the realities of a multipolar world? How does it lead rather than follow when we are shaping or talking of shaping the new global order? And maybe most interestingly, how does India manage its neighbors? Spoiler alert, sometimes with charm, sometimes with chai, and sometimes with calibrated diplomacy. Writing a long history of Indian foreign policy is no small task, but for Dhruva Jaishankar, it's practically family tradition. Samir already set us up with a cricketer's foreign policy analogy, but I cannot imagine what it must have been like, Dhruva, growing up in a time when dinner table conversations can range from, did you see the match, to did you see the strategic implications of that bilateral agreement? But jokes apart, I am especially pleased to see such a distinguished panel here today, each bringing invaluable perspective to India's international trajectory. Vishwa Shastra is both a retrospective of India's past and a blueprint for India's future, and I invite all of you here to consider how India might leverage its rich history to shape an interconnected world. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to the conversations that follow.
Now time to launch the book, so may I invite the author, Dhruva Jaishankar. The speakers on the panel today, Shamika Ravi, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Indrani Bagchi, the Chief Executive Officer of the Ananta Centre, C. Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and of course a columnist at the Indian Express, Ashok Malik, Partner and Chair, India Practice at the Asia Group, Dr. Saran, if you could also join us on stage, Mansi, if you can join them as well.
Thank you very much. It really is a privilege to be speaking here in front of you. I'm very thankful for all of you for coming, for showing interest in the book, and particularly our speakers and panelists and special guests who are here with us. I'm just going to speak for a little bit about the book. One of the things I've learned is a lot more people want to buy a book than actually read it. And one way of getting them to read it is actually to make it a bit more interesting for them. We have in India a tradition, a historical tradition, a literary tradition of things starting with a journey, a yatra. And in some ways, this book was a yatra. It started because of a journey. Between 2016 and 2019, I was based here in Delhi. I was living here. I was working at what was then called Brookings India, now the Centre for Social and Economic Progress. Actually, Shamika was a dear colleague of mine at that time. And one of the things that time did is it enabled me to travel the length and breadth of India, from Kerala in the south to Khardungla in Ladakh to the north, from the Ahmedabad in the west to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the east, and various places in between, from Bhopal and Bangalore to Pune and Mussoorie and other places. And one thing I learned, my experience is every one of these places I went to, I was often interacting with students, not just students of international relations, although those as well, but also law students, engineering students, but generally young Indians. And one thing that came across was, at that time, this is 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, there was a great deal of interest and hunger and curiosity about India and its place in the world. People wanted to know, what is India's story? Where does India stand? And they had a lot of questions. And they would ask me, I'm so interested in this subject, what should I read? And I would refer them to books. I would say, if you want to read, learn about India-China relations, read this. If you want to learn about India and its neighborhood, read Professor Muni. If you want to, learn about India's nuclear program, read such and such a book. But there wasn't a good place to start. And many of these books, while very deeply researched and very insightful, weren't often very accessible to somebody who didn't know much about international relations, who didn't know where to start. Or they were often, they used a lot of jargon, used a lot of theory. So in some ways, that was really what prompted me to write this. And much of the research for it I actually did in those years, 2016 to 2018. Events got in the way. As you may know, something happened in 2019, which there was change in government. Someone I was related to suddenly became, to my surprise, became Minister of External Affairs. And suddenly I said, maybe I should rethink some bits of this book. But more than that, other events took precedence. I joined ORF to set up ORF, what became ORF America, and moved to Washington. Then there were other circumstances. We had a pandemic, some major geopolitical events. We had clashes between India and China, a war between Russia and Ukraine. And so all of this prompted me to really rethink the book. And one of the things a struggle I had over the previous years was how to make it a bit more easy to read, more accessible, give it a logic, give it a flow. That made it a bit more difficult. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What the book does essentially, and you can see on the screens here, is I try to do three things. The first was provide a history. So in about less than 200 pages, a brief but comprehensive overview of India's interactions with the world, from ancient times to 2024. And I actually used the G20 summit last year as a cutoff point. A second, and the part two of the book, is a national strategy. One of the things people say is, well, does India have a national strategy? What is it? So this is my attempt at trying to define, at the very least, what are India's objectives, and these are what I think are mostly timeless objectives, and what should be priorities? What should people in government or outside of government be thinking about? It's not comprehensive. It's the greatest hits. But I do think it's a helpful way to think in a systematic and logical way about India and its role in the world. And finally, I wanted it to be a jumping off point. This should be an intro for somebody who's sitting for the UPSC exam and wants to join the Indian Foreign Service, or who is a diplomat coming to India who wants to know the basics about India and its place in the world. And so I have at the end over 250 books categorized by what they're about. If you want to know more about India-US relations, here are 10, 12 books to read. If India-Pakistan, India and its neighborhood, India and technology, India and the economy, national security, and so forth. This is the main structure. There are 5 chapters on the historical chapters, a very long one on India before independence, which gives, again, a very small, quick, slightly superficial, but comprehensive, what I hope is comprehensive view of India's interactions with the world before it became an independent country. Then 2 chapters on the Cold War, and 2 chapters on the post-Cold War period. And each one I have gotten questions already about why I define things in a certain way, why did I use 2008 as a cutoff point, and largely it's because of international circumstances. The second part of the book has 5 chapters, which I say are the 5 main objectives, and I'm going to go in a little bit of detail. What I thought I'd do, instead of narrating the whole book, is just give you 10 quick highlights, which I think I've described them as lessons, but in some ways the lessons are for the reader themselves to draw. The first lesson, I think, going to deep history, is that India has a long tradition of strategic thought, strategic practice, and strategic culture. And this is not often appreciated by people in India, let alone outside of India. For this, I went back to material culture, but also the documents of, from the Vedas, Ashoka's edicts, epics, but also prescriptive texts, and which India has a very strong tradition. Equally interesting, and I think worthy of much more research by people, is I found the early modern period in India to be fascinating. There was a period of time before the onset of European colonialism where you had a number of very strong Indian states that were jostling for power with themselves and with external powers as well. And in some ways, we still have it matters today because the legacy of some of that still affects our relations with Afghanistan, with Tibet, with Myanmar, and the periphery. A second lesson is I kept on learning more things about India's long interactions with the world. And Samir actually mentioned this in his opening remarks, that even before the arrival of Vasco da Gama in 1498, Indians were interacting directly or indirectly with a very vast geography, stretching from East Africa, from Mozambique and Tanzania, to across the Indian Ocean to what is today Indonesia and the South China Sea, as far north as Central Asia, and as far west as the Mediterranean, and indirectly even farther, up to Japan and Korea on the one hand, and to Morocco and Spain and Scandinavia on the other. Again, there's a common view that India was a world apart. It is how Henry Kissinger actually described it in one of his books. But factually, that's misleading at best and erroneous at worst. A third lesson from pre-independent India, and one that really stayed with me, was a combination of factors. One, the world took an interest in India even when India did not take an interest in the rest of the world. And that there was a natural logic of trade and connectivity that brought people to India, that shaped India's environment in many ways. And combined with that, the importance of the maritime domain. And that really what changed so dramatically in the middle 18th century was that suddenly you had a monopoly of power in the Indian Ocean. Until that point, it was a contested space. And so it has very immediate lessons for today, which is why India should not ensure that there is another monopoly in the Indian Ocean, and that it would have very existential consequences for India today. Oh, I jumped forward. A fourth lesson, moving to independence, is from the stroke of midnight on August 15th, India and its leaders had to deal with the question of the use of force. And it was very immediate on the question of the annexation of princely states, but also with completing the process of decolonization with French colonies and certainly Portuguese colonies as well. But moving forward, there is with quite a great frequency, India had to contemplate whether or not to use force, how to justify it, when it was appropriate, and so forth, in a variety of contingencies with China, with Pakistan, and in the neighborhood. People, of course, know the major wars of 1962, 1965, 1971. But also, what I tried to highlight is episodes such as Natula in 1967, Samdorongchu in the 1980s, Siachen in 1984, and others. And again, when you bring it up to the present day, this is these lessons from these episodes are worth contemplating today. And when we think about the surgical strikes or Balakot and other recent incidents. A fifth lesson, and one, again, this is one I actually had to learn a lot, was how much foreign policy was connected to domestic policy. Not just now, although perhaps the salience of that has increased, but even earlier, even from independence and perhaps even before. And I actually had to dig quite deep into economic history, a field I had less familiarity with, on industrial policy, the 5-year plans, and the consequences, both how these domestic economic policies were shaped by India's interactions with the world, for better, sometimes for good, sometimes not so good. but also it had consequences for India's role and power and its ability to shape international outcomes. And on the positive side of the ledger, there were episodes such as the IITs, the establishment of the IITs with international assistance, the Green Revolution, the software boom in the 1990s. But there were also negative consequences of that, and I go into that in some detail. Related to that, it's not just the economic realm, but technology has always played a very important role. I devote a fair amount of attention to the history of the nuclear program, but equally important was space, telecom, and a number of other technologies over the years. And one of the things, again, I learned in the process was sometimes how some of these efforts were stillborn, good ideas that were not fully implemented. A sixth lesson, one that I think would be appealing or of interest to a lot of people, is really the origins of the China and Pakistan challenges for India. And again, people read the news today or in the last few years, but in sometimes the context, why did we end up with war in 1962? Were there opportunities to engage Pakistan before 1965, when the relationship changed in a very dramatic manner? And so, again, a fair amount of the narrative also goes into these two relationships in particular, which have loomed large in India's strategic consciousness. A seventh lesson, and this is getting into the policy side, is, and therefore more my own views rather than sort of descriptive or objective reality, is I make the case that India has long had a national strategy, even if it has not always been articulated. But beyond that this has been a largely realist and interest-driven strategy. And if anything, the chronological narrative also shows episodes where India deviated from that, and sometimes that had costs with, in terms of relations with the United States, with China, with Pakistan. And so it does make a somewhat unabashed argument that India is always best served when it prioritizes interests over ideology. Lesson 8, we've been seeing a lot in the news lately on Bangladesh, on Nepal, on Sri Lanka. And one of the things, until quite recently, there was very little scholarship on India's relations with these countries, which are quite important for India, obviously. But when you go to Kathmandu and Dhaka and Colombo and Male, for them, India looms very large. And what I wanted to do was actually put the neighborhood front and center in this narrative. And indeed, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the neighborhood and some of the structural realities that India has to contend with. But I also go into the past, the civil wars in Nepal and Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan case, Indian intervention in that, but even previously treaties that India signed with these countries, which I think is important and is often less appreciated today. Ninth, one thing that comes out particularly in the policy, the part 2 of the book, is how much China's rise looms large in India's overall foreign policy, not just bilateral relations with China. And one can make the case that China, what China does and how China behaves, influences India's relations with many other countries and regions, from Russia to Pakistan to the United States to Southeast Asia to Africa. But also a number of other policies related to that, to India's trade policy, technology policy, defense procurement, and so forth. And so it's quite, I think, quite stark that China today, and actions that China takes or does not take, in various ways affects India's policy on many other issues that until 20 or 30 years ago were not necessarily impacted in the same way. And the lesson for that actually for India is that we need to understand China much better. And finally, what I've tried to do is, we're here at a venue associated with Pandit Nehru, India's first Prime Minister. His portrait is actually on the wall in front of me. But one of the things I try to do is show how much has changed, particularly after 1991, beyond non-alignment. And in some ways, true non-alignment, at least as Nehru envisioned it, really only lasted for a very brief period, arguably from about 1953 to 1955, 1955 being when the Soviet leader Khrushchev came to India, to 1965, and certainly by 1971, when India signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, we really saw the end of non-alignment as at least as it was originally envisioned. So it was really only a 10-year period or so that we really had non-alignment, true non-alignment, if you will. Of the latter 2 decades of the Cold War were informed by India's alignment with the Soviet Union. But then after 1991, the circumstances changed, and you had about a decade and a half of US unipolarity and the conditions around that and how it affected India. And then after 2008 in particular, China's rise and the consequences of that for India's strategic environment. Finally, I have tried to make this book interesting and engaging and fun to read, rather than just simply a list of names and places and dates. And so I've tried to litter it with anecdotes that I thought were sometimes not important per se, but in some ways interesting or curious. And so I hope readers, even the most well-informed readers, may know a lot of the story and a lot of the content of the book, but even they will find 1 or 2 things, hopefully, that they will say, oh, I didn't know that, that's interesting, I wasn't aware. And these are just some of the examples I give. I certainly wasn't aware that there was an army of 10,000 African mercenaries in the Deccan in the 17th century, that an Indian started a communist party in Mexico, the building of the Delhi metro, that was a particularly interesting thing, and how at least 7 countries were involved in various ways in terms of financing, technical assistance, training, in building something that we now take for granted here in this city. So I found there's evidence of a trade agreement between Romans and Kerala that goes back 2,000 years, arguably India's oldest surviving trade agreement. It's in a library in Vienna, in Austria. So again, I've tried to litter it with some interesting things, episodes like that. Finally, without further ado, I just want to give my thanks to many people and their kindness and patience and wisdom that I have benefited from. First of all, ORF and Samir and all of his colleagues and my colleagues who made this event happen. It's a great team. We are a global team now. We have presence in 3 cities in India, in Washington, in the UAE as well. We do activities. I was in Brazil 2 weeks ago, Germany last week. Half of ORF was in South Africa a few days ago. So we're really now truly a global team, and it's been very exciting to work with ORF over the past few years. Secondly, I want to give my thanks to Penguin. They've been extremely patient because I actually agreed to write this book in 2016 and it's only materialized 8 years later. So they've been extremely patient and generous with me. And so do want to thank Manasi and her colleagues. And finally, I want to thank many, many people whose work I drew upon to make this. Some people obviously more actively, some of them at institutions I was affiliated with, at ORF, what was in Brookings, India, and other places I've worked. But also, I probably cite at least 300, maybe more authors, some of whom are actually in this room, whose work I drew upon, and they did the hard work of mining the archives, of translating things, of diplomats who wrote down their memoirs, which have proved invaluable. And so many people in the strategic community who I want to give my thanks to, and certainly the people you're going to hear from next. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this book. One thing, when we were deciding how to launch this book, the tradition is to have a chief guest and somebody to. And one thing I decided to do was invite 4 people, all of whom I've known now for maybe at least 15 years, in some cases longer, all of whom I've worked with formally or informally. But the 4 people on the stage are all with me are all remarkable in their own rights. All of them are great thinkers and writers on foreign and economic policy and public policy. You should read all of them. But secondly, they're all institution builders, and we have something in common in that way. We've all had to run and lead institutions and deal with the day-to-day frustrations of some of that. So I'm really privileged to have 4 people who I consider friends, mentors, people I have learned a great deal from, to join me in inaugurating this book. And what I thought I would do is I would moderate a discussion with the 4 of them, and then if we have time, maybe take a few questions from all of you. And rather than talk about the book itself, and they all have received advance copies, I wanted them to talk about some of the themes in the book. And so what I thought I would do is I would start with Dr. Rajamohan here, who is one of India's great strategic thinkers and analysts. And one thing he and I have spoken about and agree upon is we don't often think about the historical context enough, that the strategic community, and the discipline of political science often overlooks history as a discipline. And so one of the things I want to maybe start with you is when you went over the historical chapters, or if you just think broadly about the historical overview, what are some things that people get right and get wrong, and where are the misconceptions that you think can be addressed? I try to address some of the misconceptions in the book, but certainly not all of them.
Yeah, thanks, Dhruva, and I think congrats. Let me join Samir and all the other panelists to congratulate you on this book. I think on the history question, in fact, your first chapter talks about it. I think we don't have enough pre-47 history. It's not something the historians pay attention to because it's really not the central. So in some ways, foreign policy history, because I think the moment you have a territory, any territory, territorially organized communities, they have foreign policies, how they relate to other communities. So in many ways, it's one of the oldest elements of community formation. But I think you touch upon some of the elements, and I think we need a lot more of that. A lot of our history goes back long ways. Beyond Arthashastra, the Kautilya's theory, there's really not enough diplomatic history. I mean, there are not much manuscripts. But what we have, I think we need to resurrect a lot. Especially, I would say, the princely states. I think in the last 10 years, our Ministry of External Affairs has done quite a bit with the archives that exist. But given the fact that we had 500 princely states, a large amount of India's history is there in those archives. And the state governments really, it's not their main interest, but I think some way the government can actually salvage those archives or centralize them or bring to national level so that people can access it far more. A second aspect, I think, is I think since we tend to begin in 1947, I think the British period is somewhat understudied. Again, it was a period of national movement. But I think in many ways, the turning of India from a territory into a modern state took place under the British Raj. So therefore, many aspects of our geopolitics continue to be inherited from that period. So I think while the colonial extractive phase is real, there is also the formation of core ideas of how India as a geographic entity must relate to its neighbors. There I would just add the final years of the British Raj, the consequences of how the final years played out, the partition of the subcontinent, is something that continues to resonate with us today. The two large integrated historic spaces like Punjab and Bengal, by dividing them on religious lines, it has left a deep, deep wound, and I think that continues to resonate even to today. So I think understanding the tragedy of that partition and the need to find ways of overcoming it becomes very, very important. And the second aspect of the British period, Britain was, for all the talk about Britain unifying India, it did not live as a single coherent territorial entity. It was like a Swiss cheese. I mean, there are a lot of different elements to it. The frontiers were undefined, loosely governed, the so-called agencies, whether it's Northeast Frontier Agency, Balochistan, Kashmir. You had a lot of places where the Raj did not fully exercise authority, but left it to the local rulers to do it. And it is really those areas today that are deeply fought, whether it's on the Afghan frontier, the Burmese frontier, or the Tibetan frontier, the problems that were left by undefined, undemarcated boundaries remains with us. And I think studying those problems are historical, and I think we need more of that. And I think your book does something, and I think maybe your next book, you should look at more of that historical, not from a historian perspective, but I think even understanding, because I think the tradition has been everything happened in 47. There was a revelation in 46, September 2nd, was it? Nehru spoke to All India Radio, and there was nothing before. So I think we need to go back a lot more to understand where we are today.
No, absolutely. And, somebody asked me yesterday, I think, why hasn't that happened? And it seems to me that there are two gaps. On the historian side, there's often been a skepticism of power politics. So, where we have cultural histories, we have social histories. There's been a traditional skepticism of those political histories going back, and certainly international relations. The second is part of the blame falls with political scientists as well. And there's kind of, the field has developed in a way where nation states became the unit of work. And so everything before modern nation states are not given the same amount of rigor. They're not used in analyses and so forth. But just some thoughts on gaps that could be filled. I would have loved to have found more on the foreign policy of the Marathas or the Sikhs or the Ahoms.
The archives are actually.
Yeah, exactly, right. So there's a lot to be done there. If there are students in the audience, PhD students, these are ideas for them. The Pali canon, the Buddhist histories of of 2,500 years ago, actually have a lot on statecraft and competing states in what is today UP and Bihar. So somebody who has the requisite language skills, there's actually a rich material that has really been understudied. Turning from history to economics, Shamika, you're now at the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. You've been a professor. You've worked at think tanks. But again, one of the things that I really learned in writing this book was a lot of economic history, and had to force myself to read a lot of it. But I want to ask yourself two things. One is looking back. Could you speak a little bit about how the Indian economy, the independent Indian economy, had implications that were external and was also influenced by, were there roads not taken in economic policy because of the international environment? And then also, if I can ask you to look ahead a little bit, where do you see, in some ways India is in an opportune geopolitical space, has very positive relations with many countries in a way that it did not always historically. What should India be focused on in leveraging that for its own economic development?
Thank you, Dhruva, and congratulations. I saw the first draft of this book several years back, and I'm really proud to see it in its current form. Just as a shout out, this book is really meant for the youngsters in the room. It's also meant for generalists to give you an overview of many aspects of foreign policy in India. And definitely I enjoyed that draft. I look forward to reading its final version. Dhruva, let me first look ahead, and then, because I'm consumed by the current situation we're in. One thing to recognize is that we learn from our past, but we also learn a lot from experiences of other countries, which started with similar sort of conditions as us, or even when they were different. One thing I think is very poorly understood is that, countries that modernize or industrialize late in the process almost never do it under congenial or good environment. Generally, it is almost adversarial. And we have seen this in the case of most East Asian countries. We have seen this in the case of many European countries as well. So at a time when we're thinking of Make in India, and we definitely want to become much more industrialized, we've had a complete rethink, 180-degree shift in terms of the way we view manufacturing in India. 10 years back, if you visited Delhi, the common phrase that you'd hear is that India has missed the manufacturing bus because services is doing well for us, it's our engine of growth, so why should we bother with industries, no? And here we are today, where every country which has benefited from globalization on account of importing or having close ties with China, and therefore imported lots of cheap outputs and inputs and so on, today have constant struggle of different kinds in the form of fragility of institutions. We are seeing political upheaval, including the G7, which we have always believed have had very strong institutions, but they're all facing the repercussions of having certain kind of trade relations with China over the last 20 years. All those countries today are pursuing policies of industrial policy, or they're implementing different aspects of industrial policy. By the way, industrial policy is really a euphemism in economics, which we use to describe government really investing serious resource into bringing a lot of manufacturing jobs back home. Right? So many countries are beginning to do what we faced tremendous amount of pressure even within the country when we tried to steer and move towards Make in India, and why we needed to do this also from a strategic point of view. No country historically has made the transition from agriculture to services completely bypassing manufacturing. Right? So there is no reason to believe why a 1.4 billion economy of such a large population, largest in the world, should even attempt something like that. And yet, these are all now, in hindsight, we're having to prove this through scholarship, through writings and comparisons, that we are industrializing late and we are going to be faced with adversarial conditions, pretty much like most countries of the world have had. If you look back, Dhruva, we might have been one of the very few countries which brought in a minimum wage legislation at a time when the economy really hadn't grown very much, and thereby we made our labor far more expensive. If you look at Japan, again, late industrialized, they grew for almost 100 years before they brought in such legislations. So you learn that, there's a considerable amount of pragmatism that goes into determining economic policy. And a lot of trade relations, a lot of foreign policy from a real day-to-day perspective feeds into a lot of our economic policies as well. And today, we are trying to do two seemingly contradictory things. We are trying to globalize because pretty much like China, we are one of the biggest beneficiaries. We brought up hundreds of millions of people out of poverty on the back of having an export-led growth over the last 30 years, and we benefited tremendously. But unlike China, which has a repressed domestic demand, Indian domestic market is strategically of great value because we don't have a repressed demand. That is why the global upheavals of different kinds, they do not percolate down to our day-to-day affairs of the magnitude that China, for instance, foresees, right? Now, that gives you a certain cushion, but we are learning a great deal from China, but we also know that we are not China. We don't want to be China. We are going to do many things very differently because our institutions are structured differently. The rules we have adopted are very different. I think what I like about this approach, what you have had to also presenting the different 5-year plans, etc., is, today we also run the risk of making things very binary. Nehruvian policy was bad, and we attempted everything in the past which was bad. And, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight and a lot of empirical evidence since. But at that point in the beginning, I think the thinking was that if we go for heavy industries, and you have noticed this within the country, industries were almost entirely set up on the western part because our natural resources are focused on the eastern part. So you wanted to spread the risks of too much concentration and so on. But it has had huge implications. Down 75 years, industrialization begets future industrialization and future growth and modernization, as a result of which, often today, what people mistakenly think there's a north-south divide. Indian economy is increasingly seeing an east-west divide, largely on account of our original policy. So there is a lot that we can learn when we go back to how the thinking evolved over time and what were we inspired by. And I think foreign policy, even at that point, was a very important factor that went into how we designed our economic policy, as it happens to be even today. Thank you.
No, actually, you touch upon some of the things that I found quite fascinating about all of this. Partly the need to have partners. The other thing I do go into is slight digression in the book is on looking at other models, and briefly, how the U.S. and even Russia were late starters in some ways. But the two I focus on a little bit more. One is Japan in the late 19th century, and the second is China after 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. And one of the things that's interesting, I went back and read on Deng Xiaoping and the Iwakura mission in Japan, is we know the success of a lot of that in manufacturing in Japan and China and what happened, but we often overlook the difficulties that they emerge. And some of the difficulties in the debates they were having in Japan in the 1890s, in 1880s, 1890s, in China in the early 1980s, actually are quite not that dissimilar to some of the debates we're having here on industrial policy. The other thing I think that was interesting to me was how different, in some ways, we were all the product of phases. So, people wonder about a mixed economy when India became independent, but that was really much, even in the US and UK. The US was coming out of the New Deal and a war economy. The UK was, providing the NHS. It was the mixed economy was actually much more. It was the conventions of the time, and then you had a sort of phase in the 1990s and 2000s where there was a sort of more neoliberal convention and trends. And today again we're moving into industrial policy. And so what I do also try and talk about a little bit is why India made those decisions. There's a fair amount on PLI, on trade policy, why India decided to withdraw from RCEP, but why it entered into other types of trade agreements with others. So I hope that it addresses some of the issues you brought in. If I turn from history to economics to journalism, Indrani, before running the Ananta Centre here, was for many years a journalist, and perhaps one of the best beat journalists covering the diplomatic and foreign policy beat in India. And so what I want to ask Indrani is, you really had a front row seat to a lot of foreign policy developments over the past 30 years or so. What has changed in your view? What did you experience? You actually lived and felt through the changes. What stood out for you when you look back?
Thank you, Dhruva, and congratulations. So much of my past life came to life in your book, and that's one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much. Well, the first thing is, so I started covering the Foreign Office the year the nuclear tests happened. And I have to say that in those days, we used to travel with the External Affairs Minister. We don't. But anyway, so that actually did give us a lot of, front row seats. We've traveled for years together. What stands out is former Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh's first visit to China after the nuclear tests in '99, where he sort of confounded the Chinese with a Rajasthan parable and delivered in that unique voice. And it was
Didn't he also sing a song at a dinner? There was an episode where he...
That was
ASEAN dinner.
ASEAN, yes, that's right. And what changed? So when I was reading your bit about the nuclear diplomacy post '98, the Foreign Office and the establishment confronted one reality, a reality that was sort of thrust on them on the 11th of May, thrust on all of us. But how they learned to defend it openly is a learning in the establishment. Because previously, I'd say a lot of policy articulation happened when Indians saw others saying what they really wanted to say, and so they kept quiet because somebody else had said it. They didn't need to say it. And one of the things the nuclear tests did, because we had to defend ourselves, to defend why we did it, the strategic rationale, it was encapsulated in the Jaswant Singh / Talbot talks, but even otherwise, the entire establishment at each level had to do their own defense. And that was, in my view, changed the way they started to think about India, themselves, and the world. That became a lot sharper after when we signed the nuclear deal. And for the next 4 years, it was a different sort of defense. It was a lobbying. And again, something that was not quite the norm earlier, to have diplomats actually go out and lobby for a deal, find ways to sort of marshal support around the world in an absolutely hostile international environment, because nobody really thought that deal could go through. Then, of course, we went and signed the
Sham Saran had to travel to Ireland and New Zealand and places like that.
Absolutely, very, very. And there are hysterical stories on that. And then of course, we went and did the nuclear liability law, and that was that. But the other thing that changed was Pakistan and terror. Again, if you just map that, you have a section on the origin of the terror infrastructure, but it was a lot more than that. I mean, we were standing outside Parliament House the day it was attacked, and that itself was a different. But if you go back to Kargil, for instance, Kargil was the first televised war. The whole idea of briefings by the Ministry of External Affairs, the whole concept changed. And in a sense, the war came to our homes because, again, we commemorated the deaths of Indian soldiers in every village. It became a thing. And you could see 6 months later when IC-814 happened, the same media became a source of immense pressure on the government. But the difference was, we went through years and waves of terror attacks. And at every stage it could almost be like clockwork, where about 6 months later you'd get back to some kind of an outreach, and then things would get back to whatever it was prior, when people said, oh yeah, we cannot stop talking, etc., etc. Then Mumbai happened. But slowly you could see the change, and I go to 2016, where I think we made that strategic decision to take a military response to acts of terror. It completely changed the playbook, and that was a journey of almost 15 odd years, which was quite interesting.
Two things on that jogged my memory. One is, when on the Pakistan side and the approach to terrorism and how that has changed, one thing that I think really comes out is how much India has dehyphenated itself from Pakistan over the past decade or so. And I think particularly for younger people, how much that the terrorism issue loomed so large, certainly until 26/11 and even for a little bit after that, that was such a big deal. And today it is, thankfully, sort of diminished a fair amount.
In the early years, when we used to running between the Pakistan High Commission and Shastri Bhavan to report on, a joint secretary then told me that we would have solved Pakistan if you had removed it from page 1. So.
And another thing you mentioned, you pointed to the nuclear tests as sort of a defining moment, and it's interesting also how partly it's a generational, how we are, that as a country for India, but also a lot of us have a sort of defining moment for us. And actually, I was quite flattered that Samir likened me to V.V.S. Lakshman, because for people of a certain generation, the 1971 cricket series in the West Indies was a defining moment. For others, it was the 1983 World Cup. I was born after that. But for me, actually, I think it was V.V.S. Lakshman's at Eden Garden, his innings at Eden Garden, which was really, this was in India beating Australia at that time. That was really a coming of age moment. So we, even as a country, we've had those moments as well. Ashok, you are now at the Asia Group, but you've had a very interesting career as somebody who was a journalist for many years, a think tanker at ORF, then worked at the Ministry of External Affairs and made a President's Office, and then Ministry of External Affairs, and then now in the private sector. So you've had an interesting vantage point of somebody who's worked in journalism, in think tanks, in the government, and now in business in the private sector. How do you feel those fields have changed in India? And how has the interaction amongst these fields changed in your over your career?
Thank you, Dhruva, and congratulations on the book. I have given it a very rapid read. By that, I don't mean I skimmed through the pages. I mean it was so smooth to read. I actually finished it fairly quickly, which is a metric by which to define a successful book, I assume, and I wish you all the best for this book. To answer your question, I'll use 3 points. First, if this were 40 years ago or 35 years ago, you would not have written this book. You would have written another book, a book for perhaps India's strategic community, however you define it. All 200 of whom would have bought it at Barisans. This is not a book for that community. This is a book for the intelligent, generalist, layperson, non-strategic community member who has an interest in India's engagement with the world. You are trying to explain to that person India's external engagement and, if I may, the sources of Indian conduct. 40 years ago or 35 years ago, there simply wouldn't have been enough of a market for that explanation. Today there is. Now, what is the source of that market and how has it manifested itself? I would say we need to go back to 1991, which is a pivotal, we have many pivotal years in Indian history, but 1991 for our generation is really the pivotal year. The foreign minister is in the room, and he's often spoken about India's foreign policy having evolved from non-alignment to multi-alignment. Now, what does this mean? You can define it in many ways, but in a sense, a country can only be as non-aligned as its economy allows it to be. In 1991, when we began to open up our economy, our GDP was $275 million. And about 15% of that, or $40 million, if I remember correctly, comprise external trade. Today, we have a GDP of close to $4 trillion, about 45 to 50% of which comes from external trade. So we are simply much more invested in the world, whether it's the government, whether it's big business conglomerates, whether it's the average middle-class family, the prosperity of which depends much more on external engagement. And that explains why Indian foreign policy, India's relationship with the world, what speeches the foreign minister gives or the prime minister gives, or why a book of this nature has a much wider readership and audience today than previously. The third point I'd like to make is, how has this manifested itself? This has manifested itself in new influences on foreign policy. On some occasions, those influences are even drivers of foreign policy. Number one, business. Business is much more engaged with foreign policy. I know this because I have been absolutely astonished as to how much my previous job, my 3 years in the foreign ministry, intersects with my current job at a business consultancy. I had no idea it would intersect to this degree, but it does. Second, technology choices. Third, the diaspora, the growing diaspora, the influence of the diaspora, the osmosis with the diaspora. And fourth, public opinion, as manifested in the media and social media. Sometimes it's noise, I agree, but it is an influence out there. What this also means is that foreign policy managers today simply don't have the agency or the autonomy which their predecessors did in a previous decade. So the foreign secretary in 2024 has to be much more conscious of multiple determinants outside South Bloc, outside Lutyens Delhi, outside even the city of Delhi, much more than his predecessor in, say, 64 or 74 or 84. And those really are the remarkable changes I've seen in the past 30 or 35 years.
That's fascinating. Actually, the book begins with a brief anecdote about Tata acquiring Jaguar Land Rover, which, again, the symbolism of it was significant, but it also shows how much business is central. And there's also a fair amount of technology, not so much on public opinion, and perhaps next edition will include some of that. But on the diaspora, certainly, one of the things I wanted to explain is we all know there are ethnic Indians in Fiji and Mauritius and Guyana, but how did they get there? So there's a little bit on that. The British period, yeah. So in Suriname, there was a treaty actually with the Dutch. So I think how the diaspora was created, including in East Africa and other places. And then on the technology front, again, there's a fair amount there. Again, one of the things I learned, I had to go into a lot of detail as to what exactly changed policy-wise in the 1990s that allowed for the software boom. And it was when you look back, it was a combination of three very strange things, and it's not always planned. One is there were some actual policy choices that were made to make it easier to import certain equipment, to subsidize high-speed, what was then considered high-speed networks. There was, you had trained engineers. So in some ways, this was a culmination of 20, 30 years of investments in education. And then there was demand. Right, so suddenly you had a Y2K problem, and so even sometimes it was policy, sometimes it was accident, it's a combination in fortune beyond India's control. But these were the products of that. So another thing I try and go into a little bit on the telecom side a little bit, but also rapid transport and how that developed. Sure, please.
I think it was not just the Indian labor was moved through force. Once slavery came to an end, the Indian labor, indentured labor became the principal vehicle for producing sugar around the world in the colonial world. But I think what is not discussed enough, I think, in India is really the Indian capital moved across the borders. That the empire gave the Indian capital a freedom to go invest in other places, whether it's in Africa or all across Malaya, for example. The whole rubber cultivation was done by Chettiar capital, the Sindhi capital from, Karachi, Mawad actually played a historic role. And I think the post-47 state sat upon the Indian capital, wouldn't let it function within, wouldn't let it go outside. So in a way, I think rediscovering India's business history, I think will be an exciting venture as well.
Absolutely. No, and I actually think there's been some good research now on the history of for example, the Tatars and such. You have Baghdadi Jews coming to Bombay, the Sassoon family, if you go, and then you have people from India going to Hong Kong, financiers.
Yeah, HSBC Bank.
Yeah, if you go to Shanghai, the HSBC Bank building has a mural of Calcutta, exactly. Which is an interesting thing of Calcutta is one of the great financial centers of the world in the 19th century. With that, we have about 15, 20 minutes. Happy to take questions. I'm happy to answer a few from the audience. And if you have any directed at any of my co-panelists, please. So maybe two in the front here. And if you could keep your questions brief and introduce yourselves, please.
I would like to begin by asking, you mentioned, I think it's the 8th chapter, it is titled The Neglected Neighborhood. When you title your book like Vishwa Shastra, how do you justify that? And what are the areas, if you could explain that? Thank you. This is Ananta Centre. As you know me, I've been a journalist and I'm currently associated with a think tank called COGS. It's Global South-focused think tank. Thank you.
So the chapter titled which one?
The Neglected Neighborhood. When you say
not the chapter name, but yeah, okay. Actually, one thing I've neglected to mention in my opening remarks is I've been getting a lot of questions on the title. Why do you call it? What does Vishwa Shastra mean? Why did you pick that title? One is the original title, working title I had for this was An Introduction to India and the World, and my publisher told me that's a terrible title. It sounds like a textbook. Nobody's going to buy it, and they were correct. But that's really what the book was about. So I wanted a catchy title. I wanted to imply that there was a sort of indigenous, Indian way of thinking about the world, and the two parts of the Vishwa, as many of you know now, means world in Sanskrit. We have Vishwa Guru, Vishwa Bandhu, Vishwamitra. These are all phrases that have been popularized more recently by the Prime Minister and others. The Shastra means treatise, like the Artha Shastra. And a treatise that traditionally was theoretical and prescriptive. One thing actually this book is not, and I was very keen not to make this theoretical. I wanted it to be empirical. I wanted to tell a story. I wanted it to be based on facts and what happened. So it is a bit misleading in that respect. It's not a theoretical work, but what essentially translates into treatise on the world. And that is really what, in some ways, this book is about, a treatise on India and the world. So that was the genesis of the title. On the neglected neighborhood, again, I've tried to put this central, make the neighborhood much more central to the narrative of India and the world. It is interwoven in at various points of time. I mean, the argument I sort of make there is that it was traditionally neglected, and what it also documents is how that has changed a lot. So, a good embodiment of this is SARC. In the 1980s, and initially at the instigation, it was Bangladesh and Sri Lanka that really originally were the drivers of it. There was this creation of an entity that became SARC. And it was interesting that both Delhi and Islamabad at that time viewed this proposal with a great deal of skepticism for different reasons. India was worried that this would be used to gang up on India, and Pakistan thought that India would use this to gang up on Pakistan. So as a result, it became a consensus-driven organization. And the fact is, because there was not consensus between India and Pakistan, and I tried to document this, but largely I would say the blame lay with Pakistan, which undermined a lot of initiatives that India tried to propose, bilateral and multilateral. That essentially this stalled progress on India's ability to integrate with the neighborhood. Because this was the main vehicle for that, and it was not going anywhere. And so what we've seen is, in some ways, the last few years, India breaking the shackles that shackle. And a host of bilateral initiatives with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Bhutan. Minilateral initiatives, such as a motor vehicles agreement. We have now the fact that we have more border crossings, direct flights between from India to Jaffna, which, as somebody who remembers the IPKF intervention, is unimaginable. That you have freight going by rail from India to Bangladesh, which is something you've not seen since 1971, 65 perhaps, yeah. That you have hydroelectric power going from Nepal to India and India to Bangladesh. That we have students coming here from all these countries. So I think all of this is a belated attempt at trying to ensure that neighborhood is not neglected, and it's still much a work in progress. So that was really what was meant by a neglected neighborhood. But there is a fair amount on some of the structural challenges that India has to overcome, and some suggestions as to how to overcome it. I would say largely these are things the government is already doing, but it remains a work in progress. And what I've tried to do is describe that direction.
Vishwa Shastra, Kautilya given us a Earth Shastra. He gave us some solution for the problem. Can you give some solution the way present we have an economic problem, the way Shamika pointed out, we bypassed industrial revolution. We have 80 crore people dependent on government for basic food. And we have huge number of housing problem, cloth problem. What is the solution for this of basic? And same thing, the way we have a China.
So, on the first part, absolutely it has solutions. There are actually 14 priorities that I've identified. Number one is industrial policy. So that's Shamika's suggestion is actually priority number. It's priority number two. Priority one is on military preparedness. But those are ultimately power starts at home, which is why those are the first two suggestions I make, and again some outlines as to more specifically what can be done in those domains. One more thing, you mentioned the Artha Shastra. One of the things I had to do part of the book is go back and read a lot of these texts, so I had to reread the Artha Shastra, and it's quite interesting what it focuses on. It's describing a hypothetical state in roughly 300 BC, so 2200, 2300 years ago. and what were, it's just interesting to think what were the priorities at that time. There's a lot of private enterprise, which I was quite surprised by, but there are also some micro suggestions. Perhaps my favorite is how courtesans, retirement plans for courtesans. Kautilya was thinking about how to deal with retirement. Yeah, so that was the level of micro policy proposals at that time. On the last point, I think one of the things it describes as part of the diaspora is that we live in the honest truth is we live in a competitive global marketplace, and talent will go where it is attracted. And so that is something that is a reality that India and other countries are going to have to deal with. On the one hand, there will be competition for jobs everywhere. And partly this move towards industrial policy is motivated by that. And the domestic politics of employment. The second thing is, at the same time, there will be competition for talent. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind.
I don't know how much you have covered one of the determinants, the strategic culture.
So the question was on strategic culture and how it has changed over time. I've tried with this book to stay away from more theoretical discussions. So it doesn't really engage with thinkers at different times. Certainly in the post-independence period, there were debates, and I've not tried to wade into that. Another thing people will notice is actually not a lot on the IFS or specific diplomats or anything like that. At the most, it's mostly prime ministers and very rarely other political leaders who are mentioned. So even though it drew a lot on diplomatic memoirs, it's not. So those are some things that this book is not about. What I've tried to do on the strategic culture is not say this is how it changed, but actually show changes in behavior. And so I think it's a little bit, what I hope is for you're a scholar, to read this and, use this as at least the basis of evidence. Again, this is a very superficial take, and, maybe this will help point you to other episodes or other incidents that would be worthy of study. But what I try to do is show the actions. And from that, I think you can infer what the culture and the logic and all was behind that. But I haven't gone, in an earlier draft, actually, perhaps the one Shamika saw, I had a whole section on India's the processes of Indian foreign policy making, and actually the role of some of both actors in government, and what is the role of different ministries and the parliament and things like that. I dropped all of that in this in the final version because partly some of that is changing, and partly I felt that was less of an interest. Perhaps that's worthy of.
One thing why I think strategic interests are also impacting policy making in the economic space. During the 62 war, per capita income of China was lower than India. Today they are 4.5 times in terms of per capita income. That is a big driver for why we continue and to put emphasis on economic growth. Second, if you just look at the kind of training, because I do go to the Foreign Service Institute and I conduct classes occasionally when I have time. I used to do a lot more of it before. There is growing interest in more, economics, which I think is increasingly becoming part of a diplomat's job. For instance, when we launch smart cities or training our diplomats in terms of how to get investments or what kind of credit rating have to be given, let's say, to cities, and what does it mean to give this kind of rating? What are big infrastructure projects that are likely to happen over the last 10 years and so on? The nature of diplomacy within India is changing very fast. And as an economist, I can tell you that increasingly they're both intertwined to the extent that we are driven by larger global strategic interests. But at the same time, the nature of this day-to-day job is increasingly becoming more economy-driven. And I think earlier diplomacy, from whatever little I know very little about foreign policy, mostly because of all of you here. I read, I haven't dabbled much in it, but I can tell that today, we don't make a distinction between Indian interest driven by the government and Indian interest driven by our industry. Because at the end of the day, they pay taxes, they employ people. They are very much a part of the Indian interest, right? I think that distinction, which used to be quite severe or perhaps quite compartmentalized before, that is increasingly disappearing. And you have seen this in terms of the G7 particularly used to have that as a part of their, for instance, almost all our conversation with the Americans used to be about USTDA, no? I mean, the Trade Department concerns used to be a very large part of the conversation that the diplomats would have. And we see why that was the case. We see increasingly with the Chinese that is the case. And as Indian economy continues to grow, and as our global sort of relations grow, also with the global south, almost all our stories are from the north. But lately, if you just see the kind of interest that exists within, let's say, Africa or rest of Asia, particularly for the digital public good, they want versions of Aadhaar, they want versions of UPI. And our diplomats are the first line of contact who then take those ideas and sort of bring it back and foster these economic relations. So the nature is changing, and it's changing day to day.
Just one word. Before the Indian Foreign Service became the Foreign Service, it was called the Indian Political Department. And the Foreign Service officers were called the politicals. They were political officers posted in the periphery of India or in these other princely states, engaging in political affairs. For a long time, even after independence, politics was the focus, but today I think commerce and economics have become, as Ashok pointed out, in a $4 trillion economy today, $1.4 trillion is your export and import. So in a way, the deep interconnection between India and the world and managing it has become one of the main challenges for not just for the Foreign Service, but the government as a whole.
It's quite interesting. I don't get into this in the book, but the Foreign Service has really had to, and Indian political leaders as well, have had to change their knowledge, update their knowledge on diplomacy every decade or so. In the 70s and 80s, they had to know about nuclear diplomacy. In the 90s, they had to learn about commercial diplomacy. In the 2000s, it was diaspora diplomacy took the front seat. In the 2010s, it was climate diplomacy. And in the 2020s, it's really tech diplomacy. Today, I heard at something I was at, we had a joint secretary from MEA who gave one of the best explanations I've heard on what ORAN is, Open Radio Access Network. Something, if you'd asked like an Indian diplomat explaining to an audience something like that, they have to know what inferences in artificial intelligence. These are new diplomatic skills that are having to be learned. I don't go into that much. I think we have time for one more last question. I think right here in front.
Greetings. Thank you for considering my question. My name is Shrey Sharma, and I'm a research intern from Center of Geoeconomics for Global South. My question is concerning what sets in a time when we are speculating a multipolar world in the future, where a lot of countries will be rising to prominence. What is it that sets the Indian diplomacy apart? What is it that sets India apart in terms of what we can offer to the world?
I mean, it's a big question. It's all there in the book. But I think there is a certain sense of Indian exceptionalism, and there are grounds for it, because you really don't have any other country in the world that is a developing economy that has the size. It's a developing democracy of this size with this diversity, this level of diversity. And the fact is, one of the things that's amazing is India is the largest, most populous country in human history. Why is it that the lessons from India are not translated into a sort of universal appeal? Right? I'm not saying it always should be, but it's interesting how when you talk about universal values, a lot of this came up during the Enlightenment in Europe. This is really based on a cluster of small European states, and suddenly these rules and norms and values were translated to humanity as a whole. So I think India, just by virtue of its size, its nature, its diversity, offers a tremendous amount to the world. It contains multitudes. So I think that is perhaps the answer to the question. But I think a lot of what is distinct in the Indian experience is described in the book in more detail. I think with that, please join me in thanking my co-panelists and thank you all for your questions and your patience.